Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, and this is Reality Asserts Itself. We're continuing our discussion with Sabah Alnasseri, and he now joins me in the studio. Thanks for joining.
Good to be with you, Paul.
So one more time, Sabah was born in Basra, Iraq. He teaches at the Political Science Department at York University in Toronto. His most recent publication is Arab Revolutions and Beyond, the Middle East and Reverberations in the Americas. So in part one, we talked about Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia. And near the end, we kind of got into what might be the bigger strategy here, which is the breaking up potentially of Iraq. Right. The target being there's a lot of easy to get, in a sense, cheap to get oil in Iraq that's not even being exploited. Right. And then a lot of the oil that is being exploited is not directly under American oil companies, which was certainly not the plan when Bush Cheney went into Iraq in the first place. There's a lot of reasons why Iraq sticks in the throat of American military establishment. They don't like the idea that it looks like they lost in Iraq. Yes. And they don't like that Obama took troops out. The job wasn't done, and they thought if there'd been more troops, they could have finished the job. And if you define the job the way Trump defines the job, it means controlling the oil. They don't like the fact the Iraqi government is perhaps more pro-Iranian than it is pro-American. Yeah. But let's back up. This is Reality Asserts Itself. Right. And one of the things we try to do with guests is talk about who they are. But your story and the story of your family intertwines with the story of Iraq. Right. So give us a bit of your history, the history of your family, and in that, we'll learn more about how Iraq got where it is. Right.
Well, I come originally from a nomadic family. Literally, my grandfather and my father used to live in the desert. And at the later stage, my father moved to the urban center of Basra in the south of Iraq, where he settled there. So at the beginning, of the British occupation of Iraq.
What year are we in?
After the First World War, when the Middle East was divided among the French and the British Empire at that time. So Iraq was part of the British Empire.
This is what, like 1918
to 1920s, and you have the first, massive revolts against the British Empire in Iraq in 1920. And one of the figure of this revolution was my grandfather. And people in Iraq, especially in the south, they wrote a lot of poems about him because what the British Empire did, one of the things they did at that time, they used to bring their tanks and put them in front of the houses of the people, and they give them a few minutes to leave the house. If they don't leave, they bomb the house on their head, much more like the scenario in Israel and Palestine, right? And for that reason, sometimes they wanted to have let's say, highway from the Rumaila oil field to the port, and you have a lot of communities living there, so they want to cleanse the whole area from the civil population. So in one of these moments, my grandfather stood in front of these tanks, British tanks, and challenged them. If they want to bomb his house, they should bomb him first. It was a very critical moment where the British soldiers and officers didn't know exactly what to do, because they knew if they would have bombed him, probably they would have escalated the whole situation. So they rolled back, and that's where people start writing poems. And what does this tell us is that the revolt of 1920 against the British occupation was not so much a nationalist, well-organized and led movement. It was mostly a spontaneous movement where you have people, humiliated, dehumanized by the British Empire, that sparked the whole revolt and revolution against the British Empire at that time. So my grandfather, you can say, he was a proto-Arab nationalist in a sense, because there was no such a thing as Arab nationalism in Iraq at that time. And later on, my father was much more radical than my grandfather. He became a communist, and my brother became a communist. So the household in the 1950s, 60s was much more dominated by the communist ideology. Well,
the Iraqi Communist Party became
very popular.
One of, or almost the largest party in Iraq for a while.
And in the Middle East, the most powerful communist party in the Middle East, and the way they managed to expand those social bases precisely by recruiting all the enslaved, indebted, exploited peasant of the Iraqi societies. The biggest chunk of the Iraqi society, or you can say the popular classes, were peasant. And most of these peasants were either Shiites or Kurds. So here you go. You have a exploited popular class, the peasant, indebted for their whole life to their landlords. They cannot even leave the land. So because of the debt they have, the burden of the debt on them, imposed on them by these landlords. And these landlords in the south and the north were Kurds and Shiite landlords. So you have a Shiite Kurdish ruling class actually in Iraq, an exploited peasant class, Kurds and the Shiite. Whereas the so-called Sunni or other minority, the Christian, the Jews, because of their institutional experience, especially under the Ottoman Empire, they were the bureaucrat and so on, they were sustained by the British Empire. So they were running the state institution. So they were not the ruling class. You can say they were the middle class, right? The professional class that controlled the state apparatus and institutions.
So when does that change?
Well, that stayed actually until 2003, until the occupation of Iraq. So even when you have in 1958, the revolution in Iraq against the monarchy and the influence of the British Empire, the indirect influence of the British Empire in Iraq, there was a coalition between nationalists, pan-Arabists, communists, and the army. Officer, let's say, Abdul Qasim, who led at that time the whole movement. So there was a broad coalition of different.
And where's your father during this time?
Well, he was on the Communist Party of the equation.
So 58.
58, and they supported Qasim when he came to power. Although he was a Sunni, according to this new narrative. But if you look at, for instance, the biggest working class neighborhood in Baghdad is the so-called Al-Sadr city. Al-Sadr city used to be called the Revolution City. It was built by Abdul Qasim as social housing for the poor Shiite peasant who migrated to the urban center to work as wage labor, etc. So you have a Sunni, so-called Sunni officer building social housing, decent social housing for the Shiite communities. What does this tell us is that until probably the occupation of Iraq, there was some tendency in the 90s, but marginal one. Until the occupation of Iraq, this so-called Sunni Shiite divide and Christian Muslim was not present in the everyday life or in the politics of Iraq. It is a recent introduced, phenomena that it served the occupation of Iraq, and it served the allies of the United States in Iraq, the Shiite parties, who didn't have social basis, right?
And talk about the rise of Saddam and the role of the CIA in this.
Right. So, in 1963, a few days before Qasim was assassinated by the Ba'athists, by the way, supported by the CIA, he gave a speech on TV, and his intention was to nationalize the Iraqi oil. Because as you know, Paul, until the 60s, those oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Algeria, etc., they didn't have access to the oil. It was controlled either by British or American corporation. So these government used to receive peanuts on revenues. They could not pursue any project, social project, housing, healthcare, education, nothing. So the only way to have access to the oil and to the revenue of the oil is actually to nationalize the oil. That's what Mossadegh tried in 1953, and he was toppled in Iran by a CIA-supported coup against him. That's what Qasim tried to do in 1963, and it failed too. There was also a CIA-supported coup against him, and he was assassinated. And not only, there were two moments here. One of them is the oil nationalism, if you would like to call it, that Qasim represented. The other one was the Communist Party. Although the Communist Party was not part of government in Iraq, but they were part of this, independence project. They supported Qasim. So the United States wanted to get rid of Qasim and at the same time the Communist Party. So they supported the Ba'athists at that time to attack both. And you can have in 1963 one of the biggest massacre against communists in the history of Iraq. I think up to 5,000 communists were massacred in Mosul, in Baghdad, in most of the different cities of Iraq.
What happened to your father?
Well, none of them were massacred. So what happens is that instead of the Ba'athist, because here's the thing. Until 1963, the Iraqi army was predominantly nationalist, and there was a huge communist presence within the army. So you have the army actually warned Qasim a few days before he was assassinated. Right, there is an attempt, a coup or something like that against the government. We need to act now. Now, the Communist Party, they had also the same information. They could have supported, Qasim on the army against or to preemptively go against the Baathists. The Soviet Union was against it. And here's the irony. The Soviet Union actually, ordered the Communist Party at that time not to support Qasim, etc., or not to go against the Baathists because they didn't want to escalate the conflict with the United States after the Cuba crisis and after the building of the wall in Europe. So they're trying to make some concession here by supporting the nationalists or pan-Arabists against the communists. So Qasim became, in a way, a victim of both the anti-communist and the anti-oil nationalist project of the United States at that time.
During the days of this massacre, where's your father?
In the south, in Basra. Basra was less, hit by these massacres compared to Baghdad and Mosul, right? There were the more intense battles were in Baghdad because it's the capital of Iraq, where Qasim was assassinated, and Mosul. Why? Because Mosul, historically, and it still actually is until the occupation of Iraq, was the center of the Iraqi army. Most of the Iraqi generals, officers, etc., they come from Mosul, and they control the Iraqi army ever since the creation of the independent Iraq in 1932. And they were genuine nationalists or pan-Arabists, not necessarily Ba'athist. And that's one of the things, the United States mistakenly confusing the whole security apparatus and the army in Iraq for being Ba'athist. They realized after a while, when they had access to some of the archive of Saddam Hussein, up to 87% of the leadership of the Iraqi army, not only the soldiers, but the leadership of the Iraqi army, were not Ba'athists.
So your father's in Basra, and he's okay. He's not.
He's a worker. He was not an officer or general.
What kind of work did he do?
Well, he used to work also in the oil field, which is in Rumaila. And once he settled in Basra in 1950s, so he started working in the oil fields. And there was, as I said at that time, a massive immigration of the peasant from the rural areas into the city, Basra, Baghdad, and so on, because most of the peasants were fleeing, these debt and landlord oppression. The Communist Party was very successful in recruiting all these peasants, and that's why the number of the Communist Party expand exponentially in the 1950s, becomes a massive communist, so much that for the first time in history, the Shiite institution in Najaf and Karbala, and one of the most prominent figure at that time, Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, the grandfather of Muqtada al-Sadr, he created the Dawah Party in 1957. For the first time, the Shiite broke with their tradition of being non-political, non-involvement in the state. And here's one of the things I want to talk about, namely that the exclusion of the Shiite from the state institution was not due to sectarian notion and so on, but precisely because the Shiite and their religious institution insisted on being apolitical, not to be part of any state until the Messiah, the Mahdi, will come back, etc. So they were excluded not because they were Shiite, it was a self-exclusion, politically speaking. And he broke with that in 1957. He said, if we don't create a Shiite political party, all our social bases, all the peasants and so on, they will go to the communist parties. And we end up having not only less social bases, but also less revenues, because most of the Shiite, peasant or landlords, used to pay the fifth, the tax to these institutions.
And the Communist Party was a Shia-Sunni mix.
It was a mix of every segment of the Iraqi society. You have Christian, Kurds, Shiites, Sunni, Jews, Assyrian, every, sort of Iraqis were in the Communist Party. And that was the success of this party that made it so dangerous, right, to the United States and probably also to the Soviet Union.
So that party comes to power, and they're supported by the Americans in order to attack the communists.
Right. But they were not successful in 1963. Although they assassinated Qasim, de facto, the Iraqi army, represented by the brother Arif, took over. So from 1963 to 1968, you have the pan-Arabists, the Arab brother, much more closer to Nasser than the Ba'athist. But then, 1968, again, the Ba'athist pushed against the brother Arif and came to power in 1968 only, not before that. So in this period, between 63 and 68, was a relative stable, quasi-liberal phase of Iraq, where you have, parties, some sort of civil society living. It was much more liberal, not so much, nationalist as the Ba'athists took it after 1968. And they were much more closer to Nasser than the Ba'athists.
And for those who don't know, Nasser is leader of Egyptian nationalism,
right.
and very much opposed by the Americans,
right, and
Saudis.
And one of the ironies of today's conflict, let's say in Yemen, is in the 1960s, you have Egypt and Saudi Arabia on the opposite side of the war in Yemen. You have Jamal Abdel Nasser and other pan-Arabists in Syria and Iraq supporting the pan-Arabists and the socialists in Yemen against the conservative forces in Yemen supported by Saudi Arabia. The irony is not only you have Egypt and Saudi Arabia at that time on the opposite side, now they are together against Yemen, but the second irony is that the same forces they are fighting today, Al-Houthi in Yemen, they were the allies of the Saudis at that time against Nasser and against the socialists and pan-Arabists.
So talk about Saddam. How and when does Saddam come to power?
Saddam came to power at the end of the 70s, 79. And there were multiple reasons for that. But, let me go back a little bit. When the Ba'athists took over in 1968, they did not have social basis, broad social basis like the communists or the pan-Arabs and so on, even within the army, because most of the army was either pan-Arabist, Iraqi nationalists, or affiliated party with the Communist Party. So they didn't have much of, support within the state apparatus and within the societies. So what happens is, and I think that was a clever move by the Ba'athists at that time, and it was a progressive move in the sense. They realized the only way to gain legitimacy is to nationalize the oil. But the only way to nationalize the oil is to have the support of their political enemies, the communists, because they have an enormous influence on the working class in Iraq, and especially the trade unions and so on. So if you want to nationalize the oil, you want to have the communists on board. You want to have the workers, the trade unions, everybody on board. That's where in 1972 they went into a so-called, kind of national front strategy, where they nationalized the oil and start introducing a lot of social, economic projects in Iraq, like free healthcare, free education, infrastructure, not only, the state will guarantee jobs for you, but this is your right constitutionally. You have right.
This has to be politically, ideologically a big threat to the Saudis.
Right. And that's why you can see in 1972 the constitution of Iraq was probably the most progressive constitution at that time, socially in the sense of gender equalities and the in class sense, etc. And this actually lived until 1978. It went very well until at that time Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, the president of Iraq, he was a Ba'athist, but he was much more on the liberal side of the Ba'ath party. So when he was sick and went to France to be treated, that's where Saddam Hussein and the right-wing part of the Ba'athist party pushed against the left wing of it. The left-wing socialist Ba'athists were very close to the communists, and they were allied to the communists. And the reason why Saddam Hussein pushed at that time, 1979, for you can say three different series development at that time. The first one, you have the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which de facto excluded Egypt from the rest of the Arab world. It used to be the center of the pan-Arabism and so on. It was de facto, excluded. The second movement was the revolution in Iran, and it became an Islamic revolution. That means a conservative shift in a way. And the third, also in 1979, which is interesting, was the birth of Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden and the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union.
In Afghanistan.
So you have multiple conservative shifts that enable the Saudis to be the dominant political force in the region, in the wider region of the Middle East, rather than Egypt or Iraq. Right? At that moment, at that conjuncture,
in alliance with the Americans.
In alliance with the Americans. At that conjuncture, Saddam Hussein pushed, and I assume maybe with the support of the United States or the Saudis, against the left-leaning socialist Ba'athist and communists. So once he pushed against al-Bakr, his uncle actually, and took over, he started his campaign of massacring and incarcerating and suing the communists, socialists, even Ba'athists. A lot of them fled the country, went to Syria or to Russia, etc. And so it's a bloody moment in the Iraqi history, which led again to the Iraq-Iran war in 1980. Right?
Okay. In the next segment of our series of interviews with Sabah, we're going to continue the story of the rise of Saddam Hussein and how the Hussein dictatorship, which is what it became, affected Sabah's father and himself as he becomes more political and more active. And through the lens of that family, we'll learn more about the history of Iraq. So please join us for the next segment of Reality Asserts Itself.